Good morning. This is a fun morning. I feel like do I have to preach now? Like we had some amazing worship and just that dedication. But we're in the second week of this series, beginning series for this year called First Things First. And if you weren't here last week, I would encourage you to check it out online. You can see it on YouTube or Facebook. Not because I'm trying to drive traffic to our social media, but because if you didn't get a chance to hear that foundational sermon, the rest of these sermons aren't going to make as much sense, okay? Last week we talked about why God has to be first, right? Where that comes from, that God deserves first in our lives. And the primary verse that we're spending time in is Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. This is Jesus' own words when he says, "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things were given to you as well." And I ask you to do something. Do you remember what I asked last week? Yeah. Some of you even asked me questions about it this week, so that was really cool. I asked you to at least 3 times, would you read through the chapter of Matthew chapter 6? Because Jesus, as I said last week, he kind of sets us up for this whole first things first thing. He reveals to us the kind of wanderings and wonderings in our hearts and souls, doesn't he? Right? In Matthew chapter 6, he talks about all these other ways that things become first in our lives and how they manifest. And then I ask you, I challenged you last week to ask yourself one question. What's first in your heart? Because contrary to what our culture tells us at times, we have one priority, not priorities, right? There can only be one first, not first this is, right? I won't ask you to raise your hand and tell me what's first in your heart. That's between you and God. But if you allow it to, this verse will undo you. This verse will take you apart and put you back together. So we're going to spend some time in Matthew 6 today. But as we do, I want to talk us through something that I'm noticing in our community. And that is, there's this kind of war going on, right? There's this war for our time, our energy, our attention, our focus. And I don't use that word lightly, especially what's going on in the context of our military right now. God, would you continue to pray for them as they're being deployed? But I'm talking about like this kind of a fight for our attention, for our time, for our energy, for our focus. How many of you are familiar with the term? It's a relatively new phenomenon called big data. Anybody heard of big data? Okay, so this is happening right now in this room. Did you know that big data is being compiled and crunched as we're sitting in this room? So basically, the volume of data that is available right now in our world in regards to what we do, specifically electronic data, is greater than ever before. In fact, more data was generated in the last 2 years by our smartphones, our Fitbits, our iPads, all those kinds of things. More data was generated in the last 2 years than in entire human history. Did you know that? Just in the last 2 years. 4.4 billion gigabytes annually of data is being tracked. So let's think about this for a minute. I don't know why you would have this, but let's say you have a cat. And, sorry. Forgive me. Everyone's welcome here. Grace first, even cat lovers. But let's say you have a cat, and your cat's birthday's coming up. And you start talking to your friend or your mom or your spouse about hey, you know what? I wonder what I'm gonna get little Fluffernutter for his birthday, right? You start talking about you just start thinking about getting something for your cat for his birthday. Again, I don't know why, but you think about this, and all of a sudden you hop on social media. What's the first thing you see? Little cat toys and catnip. Not on my social media, but on yours, right? It shows up in your Facebook feed, it shows up in your Instagram. You're even getting emails about it. Somebody might even call you, "Hey, I heard you were thinking about Fluffernutter for his birthday," right? That's what I'm talking about with big data. You just barely start to think about it. The other day, I needed tires for my truck, right? Big mistake. I looked on one website for tires. For the next 4 weeks, I just got tires after tires after tires after tires. This direct marketing, right? It's what they call it. They use big data to direct market us. And you know what they're fighting for? You know what the competition is? Your attention, your focus, your time. You see, because researchers have determined that if someone can capture your attention, then they can capture your wallet, they can capture your focus, your heart, your energy. And so there's this huge competition. Since 2012, big data has created 8 million jobs in the US alone. Did you know that? On Google, we submit 40,000 search queries per second. 40,000 per second in the United States. That amounts to 1.2 trillion searches yearly. Each minute, 300 new hours of video shows up on YouTube. Every minute, 300 new hours show up. 1 billion gigabytes, or an exabyte. I didn't even know that existed. An exabyte is a billion gigabytes. I can't even speak. It's so big. By 2020, the end of this year, every human on the planet will be creating 1.7 megabytes of information per second by the end of this year, which accounts to, right now we're at 4.4 billion gigabytes. We're going to be at 40 billion gigabytes by the end of 2020. So there's this competition that's happening. I'm not knocking social media. I use Google all the time. Amazon was my friend for Christmas, right? Like, I'm not trying to knock social media or search engines or electronics. But what we have to understand is that our society, our community, our world is right now competing every moment for our attention, for our time, for our energies. This is not a question. This isn't like a theory. This isn't a maybe. This is our reality. Thomas Edison once said that time is really the only capital that any human being has and the only thing he cannot afford to lose, right? Time is the only capital that any human being has, right? My dad used to always say, oh, you can always make more money. They do it every day in the printing business, right? We can make more money. We can eat food and develop more energy, right? We can work harder, but time is our most precious resource. And I believe God really understands how important our time is. And you can find it throughout Scripture. There's Genesis, Exodus, and Deuteronomy have a ton about where we put our time and energy. The Psalms are full of it. But we're going to take a spot in Ephesians chapter 5 this morning. Because in Ephesians 5, Paul is talking directly to the church, right? Anytime we're starting with who we're supposed to be as individuals or who we're supposed to be as a church, I often turn to the Pauline epistles, like to the letters that Paul writes specifically to the church. And you need a little bit of a history around Ephesians chapter 5. What he's saying here, this is Paul's word of encouragement to us about our time. And then I want you to understand the context. He says, be very careful then. Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Right? New King James Version says, redeeming the time. I like that line. That we would redeem the time that God has given us. And in order for us to understand this verse, we have to understand the context. So Ephesians, again, it was written by a man named Paul to a church at Ephesus. And this was a church that he established. If you want to see how this happened, you can go to Acts chapter 18. We're not going to go there this morning. But in Acts 18, he takes two people with him to this city of Ephesus, Aquila and Priscilla. These brothers and sisters in Christ, he brings them with him and he says, okay, you need to help me start this church. And together they establish the church of Ephesus. Then Paul leaves and he comes back and spends another 2.5 years with this church. So Paul is very, very familiar with the church of Ephesus. He knows the problems that we're facing. He knows the situation, the culture, the heart, the attitude. He knows the competition for their time. Ephesus was a bustling city, kind of a metropolis at the time. It was kind of a gateway city that led towards Corinth. And so Paul knew very intimately the challenges, the issues that Ephesus was facing. And what he says Be very careful then how you live. What he's literally saying is examine. You know, like in science class when you're in high school and you have to do that like long scientific process, right? So this is what Paul's saying. Examine your heart. Examine your motives. Examine how you live. Making the most of every opportunity. Redeeming the time. But how? Let me ask you a question. And I'm not being rhetorical. I am going to ask you to raise your hand. How many of you feel like you've got a pretty good handle on your schedule? Honestly. I meant you could raise your hand if you, just so you know. Friends, that's not unusual, okay? That's actually probably more common than we realize. That many of us feel, okay, let me ask it a different way. How many of you feel like you're more of a slave to your schedule? And this is exactly what Paul is warning about in Ephesus. This is exactly what he's telling us to be careful of in the context of our lives. Is that if not, like last week I said, if we're not careful, we can take a good thing and turn it into a little g God thing, and then it can rule our lives, right? And this is what's happening in the church of Ephesus. And Paul is saying, examine your heart. Examine your motives. Examine your schedule. Examine your attitude. But how? How do we do this? How do we redeem the time? How do we put God first in the context of time? Well, we're going to start in Genesis chapter 1. You see, we did this last week. We started at Genesis 1 because we're talking about first things first. So we got to go back to the beginning, right? Genesis 1 is the first. It's how we understand time. And I want to draw your attention to something. It's not going to be up on the screen, but in Genesis chapter 1, for all of Genesis 1, God records for us, for all of eternity, an understanding of how time began, right? And so if we're going to understand what it means to redeem our time, then we have to start with the beginning of time itself. Because time did not exist until God set it into motion, right? So time did not exist until God set it into motion. In Genesis chapter 1, we talked about it last week. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I asked the question, where were you? The answer is, you're not. Let me ask you another question. Where were you when time was created? Where was I when time was created? You see, in order for us to understand what it means to redeem our time, to put God first, we have to understand the concept of time as God established it. And you and I, we have a little bit of a problem. Many of us believe that our day starts, our culture, by and large, myself included, our day starts when we wake up, right? That's the beginning of the day, right? I mean, we don't even question that. That morning is the start of the day, and then when we go to sleep, that's the end of our day, and then it starts over the next day, right? But is that how God intended it? Is that how God created time? So for 6 days, I'm not going to read all of Genesis chapter 1, but for 6 days, God creates various expressions of the world as we know it, right? And at the end of each of those descriptions of what God does on that day, do you see what it says? You can just look at verse 6. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. Do you think God messed that up? Why didn't he say there was morning and there was evening? You and I look at our days as if it's morning first and then evening. God, from the foundation, says there was evening and there was morning. Then you go to day 2. What does it say? And there was evening and there was morning. Day 3, there was evening and there was morning. Day 4, there was evening and there was morning. Day 5, there was evening and there was morning. Does God not understand time? Right? Doesn't he get it? Perhaps it's us. Perhaps it's us that don't understand the way that God established time. From what we can tell in Scripture, night came first in God's narrative of time. Which means that in God's narrative of time, guess what came first? Rest came first. Not productivity. Rest came first. The way that God created time. Because evening was first. And then it was daytime. So George MacDonald once said that sleep is God's way of giving us the help that he cannot get into us when we're awake. Sleep is God's way of giving us the help that he cannot get into us while we're awake, right? Sociologists, psychologists, they understand that sleep is the way that we not only we regenerate ourselves physically, but mentally, right? That's why we have dreams, right? Because we're trying to work out the crazy stuff from out the day. But what George MacDonald is saying, and what I think is happening, that when we think of our day starting with the morning, then we start from a place of productivity. We start from a place of doing instead of a place of being. We start from a place of getting stuff done, not resting in the one who gets stuff done. And with sleep first in our cycle, we wake up to what God's already doing in the world. When sleep is first in our cycle, in our understanding, friends, this is a completely foreign concept to me. I'll be honest with you. I've only been studying this for the last 3 or 4 months. It sounds like I've got this all worked out. I don't. But I've been wrestling through this concept of time my whole life. I come from a highly productive family, right? I come from a family whose identity is drawn from the things that they can do. I got my first job cleaning pig pens at 12 years old. Not kidding. $5 an hour. That was a while ago. And I've always had jobs. I've always had numerous jobs. And so productivity is in my bones, right? And never wanting to waste a minute. But just until 3 months ago, I never understood that God set evening first. He started with rest and the concept of time for humanity so that he could be first. Because when we're sleeping, we can't control what's around us, can we? As much as we'd like to try. In our rest, the concept of rest, God is first. And therefore, when rest is first, God is restoring us, and then he's inviting us into the participation of restoration that he's already doing when we wake up. When we wake up, God's already at work in the world. God's already moving and changing and shaping. And imagine what it must be like for God as we wake up and we're all fired up for the day. And we're like, I'm going to go do this. And God's like, have you checked? Right? Have you even thought about what I'm doing in your life? Have you even thought about what I'm doing in your family? You see, friends, if we're going to put God first in our time, it comes at the price of a reorientation of time itself. For there was evening and there was morning on the first day, and the next day, and the next day. God ordained time so that humans would begin resting in him each day. And then God ordained time so that when we wake up, we'd be invited to participate in what he's already doing. I don't know about you, but for most of my life, I've had that backwards. For most of my life, I've tried to earn the love of God by working really, really hard. Here's the other thing that we need to learn about time from Genesis. So God establishes rest first, and then work, and then rest, and then work, and then rest, and then work. And he does that for 6 days. And then you know what he does on the seventh day? We all know this one. God rests. Genesis 2:2 says that God rested from his work. And then by doing so, he sets us an example, right? So God himself rests. And then do you know that in Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5, not only does God rest, but then he commands us to rest. It's called Sabbath. It means to do nothing. That's a big Hebrew word. It literally means to cease from our striving. God himself ceases from striving. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 2, God takes a Sabbath. God chooses rest. And then he commands us, because we're kind of ignorant and kind of bullheaded as individuals, he says 2 different times, Exodus 20 and in Deuteronomy, honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So let's work this out for a minute. If God rested, which he did, and if God commands us to rest, which he did, according to Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, what does it mean when we choose not to Sabbath? Think about that for a minute. What does it mean when we choose not to follow the example of God and the commandment of God? Well, I think it means 2 things. Number 1, we disobey God. We are literally sinning. Now, I don't use this word a ton. Again, from my background, this is a hard word for me. But we are literally transgressing against God when we choose not to rest in the Sabbath. It's one of the 10 commandments. It's for our good. It's by his example. And so every time we choose not to Sabbath in a given week, we are transgressing the law of God. We are breaking the rules. Remember last week how I said when other things become first, we become disordered? Well, when the Sabbath isn't first in our lives, our time gets all disordered. So when we refuse to rest, even though God exampled it, and then God called us to it, not only do we disobey God, but even worse, we declare ourselves to be God. Is that what you mean when you choose not to rest? When you choose not to take a Sabbath? Would you look God in the eye and say, "Nah, I'm God today. I'm good. I know better how to use my time. I know better how to use my energy." See, not only do we become disordered when we don't take a Sabbath, we set ourselves up as God. So with that as a background, can we go back to Ephesians 5 and look at it again, right? Because the people that Paul was writing to, they would understand that, like, even in their culture at that time, they had a more appropriate view of time in that, right? When their holidays would start, you know, when the Jewish holidays would start, they would start at night, right? And then they would end in the morning. And it was an example of like this idea that rest comes first, that night precedes day, that rest precedes work. And so Paul is reminding the church of Ephesus that we must be very careful then how we live, not as unwise, right? But as wise, redeeming the time, making the most of every opportunity. Otherwise, not only are we disobeying God, but we are then setting ourselves up as our own gods. And I don't know about you, but I make a pretty miserable God. I do. So here's our challenge this morning. What does it look like for God to be first in your time and in my time? Did you know that we have 168 hours per week that God gives us? 24 times 7, 168. There's this concept that's going around. It's some of it's Old Testament, some of it's New Testament. And we talk about this idea of this thing called a tithe. And oftentimes the tithe is represented as a 10%. And it usually has to do with money, right? And it kind of relates back to this Old Testament narrative where people would bring 10% of their first fruits to God, basically to the church. But when was the last time you considered tithing your time? So if we get 168 hours per week from God, and we took 10% of that to give back to God, that's like 16.8 hours, right? So that gives us a whole Sabbath, right? Let's call it, 7 to 7. 7 in the morning, 7 at night, 8 in the morning, whatever you want to do. It gives us 12, 13 hours of a Sabbath, and then we've got another 3.5 hours left over. And we ask ourselves the question, like, why don't I have time to spend with God? How come I'm not in the Word? Why does my life feel so out of whack? Why do I feel a slave to my schedule? You see, because we have put something else first in our time. Perhaps it's productivity that we put first. Perhaps it's image that we put first. Perhaps it's a job that we put first. Maybe it's a relationship. But anything that takes precedence in our time above God himself leads to a disordered life. And it leads to this idea that somehow we're God and he's not. It's really what we're saying. So think about this for a minute. The God of the universe literally created the concept of time. It did not exist before him. So he sets time in motion, and he sets it in motion with rest first and then productivity. And then he showed us how to use this time wisely by his own example. Then he invites us, not even invites, he commands us to follow his example. And then we go and do whatever we want. And we skip over our Sabbaths. And we ignore the rhythm. And we start each day with this frantic pace and the alarm clock going off and our to-do lists in our head. And we end each night so exhausted and burned out and frustrated that we don't even know if we're going to want to get up the next day. Does that sound like your narrative sometimes? Sounds like mine at times. Friends, the most scary moment for me in ministry is when I realized that I skipped my Sabbath and don't even know it. When as a minister of the gospel, as a pastor, when I disobey God and make myself first. You see, we kind of come up with this idea that maybe we can do more if we had all of our time than God could do with just a little bit we give back to him. But God can do infinitely more with our Sabbath, with our rest, with putting him first than you and I could ever do with all 168 hours of our week. Because it will then be empowered by the Holy Spirit and aligned with his word. So here's my challenge for you this week. We've all basically in some way, shape, or form this morning admitted that we at times can be slaves to our own schedules. That it's real easy to just put our own schedules, our own needs, our own desires, our own wants first, and to suck up all the time that God's given us in a given week. So here's my challenge for you this week as we seek to put God first. My challenge is, have you ever done a time audit? Anybody know what that is? Some of you have probably done this in your workplaces because you're required to. But I'm talking about a lifetime audit, right? The whole of your day, all 168 hours in a week, all 7 days of the week. As we leave this morning, I put together a time audit process. This is my challenge for us as followers of Christ this morning. Would you, over this next week, would you seek God through the process of evaluating your time? Because God deserves to be first. God created time. God invited us into an understanding of what time is, and then we abuse time over and over and over again. So this is just a simple 4-step process for you. And it starts, here's 3 things you need. You need your calendar, you need a way to take notes, and you need honesty. I'll say that last one again. You need your calendar, you need a way to take time to take notes, and you need honesty. If you can't do this honestly, it's not going to help you. And I printed off enough of these for everybody to take one home afterwards. I won't be offended if you don't pick one up, but I'm going to hand them to the ushers on the way out. And what I'm going to invite you to do, 4-step process. Specify your goals. What is it that you want to understand about your time? Number 2, be careful how you record your time each day. Write it down. Then honestly, number 3, critically and evaluate how you use that time. And then finally, ask God what needs to change so that he can be first. Friends, we all know what it's like to feel like we're slaves to our schedules. We all know what it's like to wake up more tired than when we went to sleep. We live in one of the most time-starved eras in history. We've got more technology at our disposal than we've ever had in our lives, and yet we're more tired and more frustrated and more burned out than ever in U.S. history. And something has to change. And I believe that something is putting God first with our time. Giving him a Sabbath as he commands us. Spending time with him in his word, renewing us, tithing our time. Giving back to God a portion of that 168 hours that he blesses us with. Because it's not ours anyway. And what would it look like? What would it look like for our church to begin to change the culture around how we use time? What would happen in your marriages? What would happen in your friendships? What would happen at your job? What would happen with your kids if we really took this seriously? If we put God first in our time? Would you pray with me? Father, I have to confess, but first saying that I'm not always great at this. God is a recovering workaholic, a recovering people pleaser, a highly productive individual. I find it altogether too easy to run ahead of your perfect will for my time. It's all too easy to fill my schedule with so many things and then wonder why I'm a slave. And for that reason, I am so grateful for this beautiful depiction of time that you give us in Genesis 1 and 2. May we use the truth of your word as a hard reset in our calendars, our schedules in this season. And Father, would you give me and each of the members of this church the courage to be honest with ourselves this week as we take an evaluation of our time. Not because a pastor told us to, not because the church expects us to, but because you are God and you created time. And because it is perhaps our greatest resource. Teach us to number our days, says Psalms, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. God, would you teach us to number our days, we pray. Amen.